would have, not to say this isn't good stuff, but I probably would have started recording as soon as I saw my first good slide. So today we are looking at marginalized meaning making. Now, in previous versions of this class, this actually had more readings and more just ground to cover. So I don't want to feel like we're shoehorning 2 days of content into one day. I tried to really focus on the things that to me is the most impactful from this kind of line of inquiry. And this is where we're honing in on the culture side of things a little more than structure in past weeks. And we actually are going to spend today talking about one of the articles in particular, and we'll come back to some things next week. So if you didn't get a chance to read the Jacobs piece, I highly recommend taking a look at it before we come together next time. There will also be questions on that reading included in next week's quiz. But as a reminder, there is no quiz for today. And I think I've been out of the office the last couple of days. So if you've had any quiz requests since Monday, please go ahead and keep waiting patiently and I'll send those back ASAP. But ideally, if you'd sent one in before Saturday of this last weekend, you should have had access to those quizzes to take again. But definitely be in touch if you need that. I'm going to sit and pause just for a second. I know we're joining one another virtually, but that means we don't have to do attendance because it will take note of that for us. But if there's any cool announcements for the good of the group, I wanted to give us a second to shout that out. Feel free to put it in the chat or turn your mic on. I'm just going to pause for a second, see if anyone's got anything.
Hello, can anyone hear
Go ahead.
me? Oh, so my other class, I know that on March 6th and 7th, there's like an event at the school called Pizza with Sociology, I believe. It's like more for sociology majors. Um, I forgot. Yeah, but it's March 6th through 7th at 4 to 5.
Okay, thank you for that. Oh God, I heard a little back feedback. If you have details on that, send it to me. I'll also take a look to see if I probably have an announcement from the department, because those kinds of things are absolutely eligible for extra credit option 1. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. Yeah, awesome. See if we've got anything else. It looks like one more. I'd redirect your eyes to the chat. There is a go to night market happening on the 8th. So next week. Sounds like there's gonna be lots of cool stuff happening. And yeah, I will look for info on both of these to post, but definitely if you brought it to the group, feel free to send those things my way. I know I missed one last week, so my apologies for that. But I'm gonna try and keep up on that. It's a busy travel time. All righty. Well, thank you guys for that. We are gonna go ahead and jump into lecture now. Now, as I said, today we're going to focus on one of the readings, which is the piece by Al Young Jr. He actually went on to write a book called The Minds of Marginalized Black Men that ain't no making it, or well, no, excuse me, Minds of Marginalized Black Men. I don't think that's the first part. Many times there's like a quote before it, but in other instances in this class, I usually like to find the article that is kind of the first kernel or iteration of this theory. Oftentimes it's because it's shorter than reading their whole book, but it's also really cool to see what is often like a scholar's first pass at a theory or idea that they may very well spend the next rest of their career fleshing out, refining, and the like. And so this right here, this idea of the relationship between structure and agency in the lives of poor Black men, is that in and of itself. It is a concept that he would go on to expand in multiple book forms, articles in cities and towns outside of its genesis. And essentially what it does is brings together a lot of the structural considerations that we have spent the last couple of weeks learning about, and gives the individual the chance to really respond, like what what, if anything, is the role of the individual and agency when we know there is so much in that it can almost be predetermined. Now I'm seeing some questions about attendance in the chat. The real cool thing about Zoom is if you're on the Zoom, it just notes attendance for us automatically. So thank you for making sure, and I'll be able to update that later after class. But no need to make sure we've got you. Now, today I kind of wanted to touch on, for me, the high points of his argument, a handful of quotes. Now, as I said, next week we will dig deeper into the Michelle Jacobs piece, as well as, you know, obviously the agency of the individual is hugely important. But as we know, very few of us, if anyone, truly exists as an autonomous individual. We are part of networks and families and communities. And so a lot of what we're doing is also impacted by their outcomes and their experiences. So next week, when we pivot into the experiences of the working poor, we are going to take a second to pause on essentially what could this look like in a group that is outside of the traditional black-white dynamic, but may very well have a similar process of meaning making occurring between this structure and agency position. Now, what he was trying to do, and what I think it's pretty fair to say Al Young has spent his career doing, is to, much like his mentor and my mentor, Bill Wilson, is to be able to speak on things that previously had been difficult and just not done well, blaming the victim and really disrespectful at times. He, as a black man himself, was quite taken with the work of Bill Wilson, looking at, obviously, we know that class and race are interacting in different ways and producing different experiences, but how specifically is the population of interest, in particular low-skilled black men, how are they making sense of all these things? And, you know, in my own work, I actually have drawn significantly on his, because I think we do a lot in sociology to like kind of say what we think is going on or explain patterns from the outside looking in. And for me, a lot of those things I think are compelling, but we could dig deeper by asking the people actually experiencing them. What is of import there? Oops, I didn't mean to stop the screen share. Um, I did want to delete the dialogue box, my bad. Now, with that in mind, he has to take culture square. He has to take that on, like head on. And like we've said, that's like one of the more complicated parts of this inequality enterprise, is talking about how personal choices, as informed by culture, as the kind of link between us and society, that thing that helps us make sense of our world, how might that contribute, mediate, or otherwise shape this interaction as we, are first in schools, like we learned last week, and then later in the workforce. And in his mind, one implication of this approach is essentially trying to have an improved cultural analysis of low-income individuals, that the improvement lies in that their behavior could be better understood as reflections of their readings of social reality, which are based upon the material and ideational resources they've accumulated throughout their lives, and not simply as manifestations of flawed value systems or normative orientations. Now, if you remember, you could put it in the chat last week when we learned about school and inequality therein. There was a phenomenon that had been described as oppositional culture, or quote unquote acting blank. If you want to, I was like, you might recall this. The phenomenon of acting white was really in the same vein of trying to show how in a given economic and kind of social situation where, regardless of your personal choices, your personal skills, your personal failings, there is a huge amount of your life outcomes that are deeply shaped above and beyond your personal choices and agency. There is in response and in reaction to that, different mechanisms that can help cope with that scenario on a mental level, on a social level. And so in the acting white phenomenon, right, we saw that there was kind of they would tease one another. There was a denigration almost of traits that were associated with whiteness, even if that meant also associating things like intelligence, uh, being well spoken, those quote unquote hallmarks of a certain kind of culture and usually whiteness, that is somehow uniquely a white skill or phenomenon. And that can sometimes result in negative school kind of impacts. Um, Now, is it just a matter of peer pressure? Is this something that goes away once people go back into the workforce or start going to the workforce? Not by a long shot. And in fact, that's what he really wanted to look at, was if we look at really the toolkit that young poor Black men are entering the workforce with, they are acutely aware of their social reality, and that is based on, up to that point, a lifetime of an experience as a Black man that has led them to certain conclusions that in turn impacts how they move in any given space. And whether or not that is beneficial to gaining and maintaining employment is kind of a secondary concern, because they are more, as we all are, think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Before we can be thinking of higher things like self-actualization and identity, etc., we need to be meeting our basic needs. And if we know that there's certain constraints on our basic needs, those same constraints are going to impact all the rest that we build on them. Now, that's not because they are inherently flawed or that the norms in these locations are deviant and don't value the same things that everyone else does, but instead they are a direct reflection of a very accurate reading on a specific social reality. Now, with that in mind, he works around, sorry guys, he works around the concept of habitus, which I'm hoping sounds mildly familiar, because when we did our in-depth discussion of culture last, I want to say earlier this month, we did talk about habitus when we were talking about cultural capital and culture as a specific form of a resource and something that can be exchanged or accrued, maybe not as tangibly as other forms of capital, but is still nonetheless some kind of currency. And this is really building on the French concept of habitus, which is, if we use our kind of root words, it probably wouldn't shock you that this is something to do with the habits, rather that we find ourselves, like I said, it'd be too much for the human brain to, every time we did anything, have to think through every choice we could make, all the timelines and dimensions that could happen with, we pick this or that choice, whatever. So really our brain does a lot of work to like cognitively streamline that process and make things almost automatic. And when we think of, I think we could say maybe an operating system in some ways, a cultural operating system in our brain is a habitus, that there are just certain things that, by adolescence, you have been acculturated through your family, through your community, through your school, to embody certain characteristics, behaviors, and otherwise, and that is embodying your habitus, right? It's something you can change, it's something you can interrogate and you can interact with. But I think the best evidence of a habitus at work is that you don't know that it's actually, it's like a reflex. It's the closest thing, it's either an operating system or it's a reflex. It's those things that you don't realize are happening automatically until you actually maybe have a problem with them or you seek to change them. And it's so hard to change because it is so almost second nature. Now, in his words, Al Young describes habitus as the systems of durable, transposable dispositions, which means that they can be moved and taken outside of where they first began, which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them. So that's the thing about a habitus too, is that it is something that we take with us. It can be kind of lifted out of our home environment, and we, whether we want to or not, it goes with us. But it's also kind of it's always open-ended. Habitus is not so set and determined, but rather much like the other instances where culture was described as a toolkit or access to scripts, right? There's a certain level of template and improvisation that our habitus enables, because we haven't found ourselves already in every room that we will inevitably, but the rooms that we have been in fundamentally shape how we show up in all the rooms that follow, right? And it is through this vehicle of habitus. Now, one implication, oops, is that, nope, that's an extra slide. Yep, I should have deleted that. Sorry guys. Back to capital though. I'm hoping this rings a little bell, like I said, just like habitus, because we touched on this for a few minutes during our week where we dove into culture, where capital is an idea originally going all the way back to Marx with his Das Kapital, and essentially trying to theorize currency of things that are not necessarily tangible, even if they are super impacted by the things we can touch, and they impact the things we touch, the resources we have access to, all of that. Now, in Al Young's work, he's looking at capital much like the French scholar Pierre Bourdieu did, who really expanded on this in a cultural inquiry when he built on Marx's work to talk about, we know that capital, and we can think of economic capital as one of the more obvious ways capital is in all of our lives, but capital is also operating at different layers simultaneously. And so in this case, he talks about it where capital has been identified as the fuel for social mobility, right? And social mobility, as a reminder, being both the process of kind of changing income status, income classes, but it can also be a matter of culture, whether it's actually financially reflected as a change, or maybe it's just being the first person in your family to go to college, being a business owner, first generation. These are different, really tangible examples of social mobility. And it's also feeding into the larger kind of myths of American social mobility, right? That we all are going to get the chance, if through our hard work, to do better than the generation that came before. And so even if it's maybe, the arrow of our family's progress is upwardly mobile, even if it's maybe less discernible in any one generation. Now, this term is referring to resources for strategic action that exist in varied forms. And this is an homage to a rational actor of sorts when we think of economics, really boiling down to the study of certain patterns. And one of them is how behavior happens, and the emphasis on the rational actor and the things that we do kind of as a mental calculus to decide what we'll do in any given moment is a reflection of what we've lived through and the strategies that we know we have access to by virtue of that lived experience. Now, this capital can consist of material objects, but also ideas, beliefs, or even emotions. More specifically, capital is that material or symbolic, that's the key word here, symbolic entity that provides resources or access to resources that can enhance one's mobility pursuits. Now, the possession of capital can also demarcate differences between individuals or social groups. So in this way, we're understanding capital both as something that we can acquire, so we personally have access to capital and we personally acquire capital. But much like most other social things, capital is also uh, socially determined, socially exchanged. And so its value is not simply determined by our own, you know, assessment, but rather a shared assessment. It is a social object, a social appraisal. Now, in kind of digging into this further, these are the different kind of forms of capital that we see often making an appearance in the literature. Economic capital, like I said, that's the capital that I think is most tangible. We even though money isn't real, it's actually in place of the the things that we actually need to subsist with. But money, assets, wealth, stocks, these are all different forms of economic capital, not an exhaustive list by any means, but I think it's often easiest to think of the other form of capital once you have like a sense of maybe the exchange rate of others. And so if economic capital, you know, we're in a capitalist society, capital, there's that word. We know that whether you wanted to deal with money, assets, or anything else, you would have to, because that is the currency by which this society is organized. Now, it's not simply a matter, though, of money changing hands, because we know there's also things like social capital. And I would say definitely, as you guys are finishing up your essays, these are the different ways we might see culture occurring. You don't have to list all of them. In fact, you could discuss social capital as one form of culture at play, either positively or negatively. In my mind, whenever I think of social capital, I think of the it's always social connections, who you know, right? But it's not just who you know. And why that's matters is much like the other forms of capital, right? It's a social thing. It has meaning because of the thing that is shared, and that the meaning that both the people sharing it are giving to it. And it's not what you know, it's who you know. I'm sure we've all heard that expression, often used when it comes to finding work, finding a job, that no matter your credentials, your skill level, etc., your individual characteristics, um, that human capital. I didn't list this here, but you should put in the chat box if you can think of any other forms of capital, or just other ways you may have seen capital work. But human capital is what we call things like our credentials, our training, our degrees. And no matter how much human capital you have, I feel free to chime in on the chat on this as well. Like, has anyone here ever found a job or been out on the job hunt and really even been discouraged because it feels like you have all the human capital, all the credentials and resources you could have, but it becomes very clear to you that the job or the position you want, the people who get it, they aren't gaining access to these positions by simply human capital. Rather, they know someone, maybe their family works as such, or um, college. A lot of people, it's not crazy to have, you guys being first generation, myself, I know that I didn't get any help because none of my friends, we're all first gen. But someday one could say that when our kids and my nieces and nephews are going off to school, I'll be able to help them with my knowledge. They'll have social capital by virtue of knowing me and having access to a professor who can help, either helping on their essays, or what if at schools, knowing someone admissions and putting in a good word for someone. These are very real ways that social capital can impact anyone's opportunities and outcomes, and what can sometimes go too far, right? Think of nepotism, or times where social capital, it's very clear that it has nothing to do with the skills or the human capital, and that it's instead very much who you know. I always like to shout out Mark Granovetter's Strength of Weak Ties. You may have heard this in other classes, but unless it's changed, at least for the last since Google Scholar started, he was always the most, I don't think it was the most cited article ever, but it was the most cited sociology article ever. And it was essentially a test, a really real world application of that age old, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And he found that resoundingly to be true time and time again. But it wasn't just as simple as who you know that really a lot of times the information that's most helpful to us on the job search, or you're trying to find a daycare for your child, those things, maybe an apartment in a city with housing's hard to find. The weak ties, people who you kind of know through a friend, that's actually where you get a bulk of that really wide reaching information, because the people that you really fuck with, excuse my language, but like your besties, your fam, like those ones, chances are you guys are getting like exposure to the same info sources. And so the value added of their help when you're looking for work might be operating in different ways. They can talk to people, they can help maybe get a foot in the door, but they're going to have a sense of what's available in the same ways that you would. Whereas, their friends and friends of friends are going to be in a better position to give you maybe information that doesn't come across your desk normally, or put your name in for positions that you wouldn't even have thought to think of, right? Now, these are different kinds of capital that are going to make appearances in different weeks. So I want you guys to have like a really good working knowledge of them. And cultural capital, though, is in lots of ways what Al Young spends his time focusing on. Looking at how tastes, preferences, and behaviors can be associated with different social classes and or social groups. Now, I think this is probably something I say too much of, but if all else was equal and my preferences, tastes, and behaviors, regardless of what they were, if that did not come in some way with consequences, either positive or negative, it probably wouldn't matter what those things were. But we know that as social creatures in a capitalist society, with settler colonialism in its veins, there are very few instances of difference that aren't in some way given meaning, and usually a positive and negative one, right? And so you know that depending on any of these things, you could be alternatively socially rewarded or socially stigmatized. And while it's not going to maybe show up in your bank account in the same way that economic capital would, or it's not going to show up on your resume or your CV in the same way that human capital does, and it's not even, the foot in the door and the friend who puts in a good word like social capital is, cultural capital, because habitus is what we walk into every room with. When we, you don't you don't have a wallet on you, you're in a room by yourself, and I guess you technically still have your certificates and your degrees, your human capital with you, but right alongside that is your habitus. Your cultural capital is something that you are always bringing into every room, and it impacts how you move, whether that is good or bad, is much like everything else socially informed, right, by the meaning you're giving it and the social actors that are sharing that with you. Now, in the context of poor Black men, let me pause for a second. Now, Hugh the Crow, that was pretty good. Now he was, as I said, building on the work of his mentor, Bill Wilson, out of University of Chicago. That area has been thoroughly studied for probably over 100 years now. And in his graduate degree, and when he was working on his PhD, he was kind of going out into the South Side community as a young Black man. He, in many ways, could go places where white sociologists could not. He also was younger than Bill was when he was doing this work, so he could kind of pass as a young Black man, perhaps in spaces where someone who, is clearly, I was like, what am I, middle-aged? That, we stick up sometimes, or at least if we start talking. And so Al really kind of took it as like, okay, well, if we know what Bill has said about this intersection of structure and culture, like, I want to get into agency. I need to know, like, I'm a Black man who's working on my PhD, and I'm surrounded by books and voices of people telling me about men who look just like me, and they've never once lived a day in their lives, walked a mile in their shoes, let alone, seen with the same eyes and lived with the same skin. And so he wasn't shy about really outlining the different points of inequality that those he studied were constantly interacting with, that obviously would impact how they saw the world and the minds that they kind of looked into the world, the things they saw, how it was shaped. And he talked about how things like female headed households, where there were few formally employed male role models, really characterized the homes that many of his participants were growing up in, that the homes that they actually grew up in, you know, if they were lucky, perhaps they had a more stable situation with housing, but that also went hand in hand with things like public assistance, Section 8. So either they were moving constantly and eviction and household turnover shaped their lives, or they were dealing with the uh, sometimes stagnant conditions that could characterize public housing, particularly in Chicago's South Side. A great majority of those housing projects have since been demolished. And so he did work in communities that no longer exist. Um, it's always really important to point out that most of those communities were deeply loved by the people who'd lived there for generations in some cases. And so they fought for those places to still be standing, even with all the negative things that could be talked about, because they were their places, their worlds, that were deeply meaningful to them. And in these places, even with all of the inequality and negative outcomes that characterize their day to day, there was still very strong orientations towards education and opportunity. And I only say still because I don't think it's shocking to anyone in this class, myself included, that even if you're not formally employed, or even if you've struggled with incarceration, you might still very highly value education and opportunity and getting yourself ahead. But there are reasons why you may have found yourself in those situations or can't perhaps work formally, etc. Um, and so this is kind of right pushing back on that larger intellectual heritage of not wanting to fall into that trap of demonizing those who don't have access to mainstream opportunities and trying to characterize them as, oh, they just don't value that. Instead, really problematizing that with the sheer difficulty it was to actually actualize education and opportunity in the workforce without role models, resources, and opportunities to do so. Now, one could even say that it is almost a disservice if we were to continue, like if these young men did not realize the social realities that they were coming up in, they could very well move in ways that would not only be not advantageous in a economic or educational way, but it could also risk their lives. Life and limb could be at risk. And so Al Young's work, and what I personally try to build my work on is trying to bring to the world how the men in this situation see the world, so that as we try to intervene to hopefully improve their outcomes across the board, we do it in a way that is gonna work because it acknowledges how their day to day is taking place, and it's not trying to instead get caught up in the coulda, woulda, shoulda, or how we think the world is, and try to kind of force that. We don't know what we don't know, I always like to say, and Al Young had kind of seen himself in much of what was being studied, but saw very few of comparable men in a position to respond back. And so he used his position to do so. And he talks about how this is kind of a longer quote than I normally like to do, but I'm going to read it. Um, how in his work, no matter what they valued or what they would have desired for their children, none of the families of these men possess the type of cultural capital to help the sons navigate the schooling experience. In many cases, the messages were transmitted were not substantive enough for the men to employ when dealing with school. The expectation that they perform well was not buttressed by appropriate or successful intervention strategies, in large part because family members were not experienced in dealing with formal schooling institutions. Some of the parents felt that doing well was adequately reflected in consistent attendance and passing grades, the level of the past being a secondary matter. Moreover, the men could not make such basic messages about achievement meaningful while also confronting other issues concerning their families that ultimately impinged upon their education. So, no matter what dreams they may have come to through their academic journeys as children and then into adolescence, that's running right up into a lifetime of lived experience of their family, of generational experience in some places, where it doesn't matter how hard you work or what you strive for, you have a bigger chance of winding up as a statistic than anything else. And this isn't simply a matter of, even though agency is what he's focusing on and it's clearly impacting the choices and the behaviors of the men he studies, it's not simply that they don't want to move a certain way, or if they could, they would. It's instead like, how can we look at how they make sense of their social world to outline where they come to these conclusions? Where is it that they really synthesize that habitus? If we know that, we have our internal kind of cognitive process at the uber micro, agency is in some ways a reflection, right, of our choices, our agency. That's what we do in the world. Uh, Cognitive, psychological, that's really in the brain. Um, but we know that that doesn't just pop up on its own. So where are the pieces that we kind of get these impressions to build the rest of our habitus with? If we can identify that, maybe we can both impact positively or negative those processes, or we could better understand why is it that we would see communities that value just as highly mainstream things like education and formal employment, but on an outcome level do not have those experiences come to pass. And it's through schooling and neighborhoods, which is hopefully ringing some bells, because that's what we've spent a lot of this class talking about so far, is that the school, the neighborhood, these are the kind of tiny societies that we all live in, kind of like Russian nesting dolls of sorts, that are a microcosm of everything else around them, but are flavored and, uniquely texturized by the details of our own lives in real time. And if you are trying to hold space for both of these things, he talks about how one must make room for assessing how and why the functioning of the poor makes sense to them as they deal with their situations. Furthermore, while realizing that the fate of these men was profoundly more distressing than others in contemporary American society, it became obvious that these men were cultural products like any other social actors. Like others, they formed schemata of interpretations about their life experiences. The major difference between these men and more mobile individuals is that the latter possessed more of the kind of capital that was relevant for successful living in an advanced industrial society. And so much, like, kind of a running thread through this whole talk is how culture and this discussion of agency or the like is difficult to parse apart where the individual and the society stops or starts, because they're so deeply intertwined with one another. They deeply inform one another. But at the end of the day, we all know we make our own choices, we make our own decisions, but none of us does that in a vacuum. And so the meaning and the things that we accumulate through life experience will only actualize into opportunity or not if we're given the resources and the context in which that can occur. And it doesn't matter what you value, it doesn't matter what you do, if you're not in situations where those choices, those tastes, those preferences will translate to opportunity, you're not going to have the outcomes, no matter how much you value, hard work or education or et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we take this kind of theorization all together, he talks about how individual action then becomes grounded in something more than a person's value system. Instead, he's describing agency is understood as action preceded by what individuals conceive of as the structure and process of their social environment and the set of options for action that are available to them. Inherent in this consideration is the challenge of examining how different composites of capital may create alternative paths for upward mobility. Thus, being in the same social space or experiencing similar life circumstances can lead to different accounts of what's going on and whether or how that might be beneficial for personal mobility. Now, that's kind of where his analysis goes further, is that uh, it's all well and good to understand how people kind of make assessments of a situation and how they come to conclusion of what they can or can't do. But then, is that standard? Is that across different people? Is that going to operate the same? Obviously, actually, no, it's much more complex. That there is there's very much instances where the same social space, same circumstances can be at play, and you'll see very different outcomes. And while there is many structural reasons for that, when we bring it down to like the minds of those navigating these situations, the the things we see and how we interpret them drastically impact what we feel we can do. And, the more we know about, what do they say, that like our thoughts, our words create our reality. It also shapes what it is that we see. And so, in some cases, while it's not as simple as people making different choices, that is what the outside observer sees, is a difference perhaps in choices despite similar circumstances. And the explanatory factor is really how the individual is making sense of, at times, the very same characteristics as someone else. Now, I I have reached the end of the slides. I wanted today to be focused on, really, like I said, getting into the minds of marginalized peoples, whether that is as traditionally described, or in other instances in my own work. And I think even in our class, we've talked about how, even though urban inequality draws largely from previous studies of Black-white uh, outcomes and kind of differences therein, we know that this isn't an exclusively Black-white phenomenon, and that meaning making and kind of the habitus we bring into any classroom, any workforce, wherever we find ourselves in that regard, it's so shaped by the rooms and the people and places we were in before that. And um in some ways, when we as policy scholars, we're studying this hopefully with an idea to find points of intervention, that's where the rub is, that we could actually have the same outcomes or the same interventions and see radically different consequences because of this meaning making level. And in some ways, it's kind of the X factor, that there's no way to prescribe how anyone should feel or make meaning about something. And while policy might not necessarily be able to intervene in meaning making, it has to appreciate meaning making at play so that it can incorporate it, plan around it, accommodate it, what have you. Now, when we come back together next time, we are going to be in person. And as I said, we're going to touch on the Jacobs reading just to kind of bring a different group into this perspective. And in lots of ways, there is some threads coming together. We've continued our layer by layer investigation. And as I said, if we think of schools, neighborhoods being the vehicle by which our minds kind of accrue the habitus and the eyes that like we see the world with, we also aren't just ourselves making choices, right? We're usually part of households, we're part of family units. And so the things that are happening at the family level are super, super impactful. And so that's where we'll take the discussion next time. Now I was kind of hoping, I didn't think we would take the entire class hour today. So what I'm gonna do now is, we're gonna formally close lecture and I'm gonna hang on just for a little bit longer today. Thursdays are typically office hours. I can't stay on, the normal amount of time, but if you have any questions about your essay that I can answer in a couple minutes, I'm gonna open up now for some virtual drop-in office hours. We are recording today, so you'll see this recording once I'm back home uploaded. And yeah, if you have any questions, just go ahead and give me an email and a little time to catch up and I'll be back to you. But that concludes today's formal content. And I'm going to go ahead and just take a second to have a drink. But if you have questions or anything for office hours, that's what we'll be starting now. Awesome. Feel free to put questions or comments in the chat too. We can answer both places. Thank you guys. Have a good weekend. Thank you, everybody. I'm here. I'm gonna try and I'll be video on just for a second. I was gonna stop the recording because we don't need this.